Thank you for joining us for Finding God in Video Games Rewind. And today we're taking a look at something that you may not necessarily notice in your game, but it's kind of one of the most essential parts of your gaming experience. In an ever-changing sea of faster frame rates, dramatically upgraded hardware, and technological upgrades, there's been one constant in many of our gaming experiences: the targeting reticle. This little icon on our screens has been a steadfast partner with us across galactic exploration, underwater worlds of wonder, and through just about every battle that has occurred through history, fictional or otherwise. It's an unsung hero through most of our gaming experiences, providing an idea of what our character is looking at or targeting, as well as typically changing colors to identify the difference between friend or foe in the chaos of a firefight. It often helps differentiate between items that can be interacted with in the gaming environment, supplies that can be picked up versus items that are just part of the background. It normally highlights them, illuminates them, and gives us some kind of idea that we're supposed to interact with them. I can only imagine how much more difficult playing many titles would be without this handy little guide lighting the way. Imagine a gaming session or a multiplayer match in which you couldn't identify teammates from adversaries. Friendly fire would abound. Objectives would become more difficult to compete, and trial and error would become the new strategy as chaos would ensue. Friendships would fray as we firmly plant one shotgun shell after another into the back of our own teammate. Frustration would compound, and it was frantically search for which terminal out of all of these similar but non-functioning computers can actually be interacted with. While it may hold our hand a little bit, I for one appreciate the way that the reticle has become a standard part of many of my favorite gaming experiences. I was thinking it would be kind of nice if we had a little reticle in the real world, something that would highlight what is actually beneficial or mission critical around us, so we could ignore what is superfluous to our journey. Most importantly to me, to have the ability to instantly tell the difference between someone who's truly aligned with my goals and on my side versus those whose dialogue may make them seem like a teammate, but their true motivations fill our reticle with the color red, reserved for dangerous adversaries. Imagine how many problems or pitfalls we could avoid. We were easily able to identify people and situations through simple reticle identification. Unfortunately, life is much more complex than that. Relationships and circumstances very rarely present themselves in primary colors for easy translation. So let's look at some biblical examples that are showing the critical importance of being able to discern when we're facing a giant that must be stopped, when we're being pursued by an enemy we're meant to endure, and those times we should simply ignore our adversaries because they truly cannot stop us from achieving our destiny unless we stop to address them. So let's start in 1 Samuel 17. We've got King David entering the world stage in a dramatic fashion that almost everyone should be pretty familiar with. Simple shepherd boy was out making a lunch delivery when he crossed paths with the giant Goliath. He immediately recognized this monster was a foe. A rock from a slingshot later, David was standing over his fallen opponent victoriously. The Lord delivered a dramatic and shocking victory. David didn't come looking for a fight. When he saw the people of God oppressed, he responded to the call of God on his life to defeat this blasphemous barbarian. Call this one a clearly red reticle. I wish it was always that easy. Then we see things get a little more complicated for David in Samuel 24. We find an older, more seasoned David. This time he's on the run for his life from King Saul, the leader of the entire nation of Israel, someone that he was actually serving when he took out Goliath earlier. Now, Saul had attempted to murder David on multiple occasions, usually puts a damper on a relationship, and he was now concentrating the entire Israeli army on finding and killing David, the man who had been previously the hero of the country for slaying said Goliath. Saul had pursued David and his band of followers and was closing in for the kill. As a matter of fact, Saul was so close, David could practically smell him. Saul had taken a break to use the men's room, and the exact cave he had chose to do his business in was the same place David and his men were hiding. As Saul was, let's just say he was distracted, David had an opportunity to end this feud once and for all against his completely defenseless enemy. But the reticle at that time did not turn red. We see that in 1 Samuel 24, when David stubbornly refused to take the life or even harm the man who would have gladly gutted him where he stood if the sandal was on the other foot. David had a second identical opportunity a few chapters later, where he came upon Saul with a couple of his soldiers while Saul was fast asleep. In both of those situations, though, the reticle never changed colors from green to red. And in turn, David provided an incredible example of when we are to endure our adversaries rather than defeat them. David did not know the whole story or how this would end, but he did know that the Lord had not given him permission to take Saul's life or even do him harm. So, why was it acceptable for David to engage and slay the giant Goliath? But when it came to the evil, murderous, and occasionally demonically possessed Saul, the answer was to stay his hand. To understand this, we have to dive a little deeper beyond the events and into the subtext. In the case of Goliath, the giant was not an actual enemy of David, the human being, except by circumstance. We see that in 1 Samuel 17, that in this challenge, David was standing up for God against an enemy that threatened both the people of God as well as dared to defy the Lord himself. David was not fighting a personal war because he was defending himself from a vendetta or a personal attack. He was acting as an ambassador of the Lord, the same way Jesus himself created whips and drove the corrupt businessmen out of the temple many generations later. This was not the case in his period of running from Saul. David clearly stated that despite his mistakes, Saul was still the Lord's chosen and anointed king for that time. David had not been authorized to harm him. In 1 Samuel 24, David explains to Saul the reason why he didn't attack him when he clearly could have ended things was because he identified that it is the Lord's place to judge and avenge, not ours. The Lord delivered Saul into David's hands twice, but in each instance David understood that when it comes to our own personal battles and grievances, these are best left to the Lord. Finally, some enemies are simply meant to be ignored. Even pausing to give them our attention would be a mistake. In 2 Samuel 16, an even older and wiser David is on the run yet again. A lot of running for David. Probably had great cardio. This time from his rebellious son, Absalom. On his way to safety, a man named Shimei takes this opportunity to follow David and pelt him with rocks while hurling insults at the fleeing king. While David's loyal men ask permission to settle this annoyance, David shuts them down cold with an incredible response. Let him alone. Let him curse, for so the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. That's a response that's kind of hard to fathom. And this gives us huge insight into why David was called a man after God's own heart. In all these circumstances, from the giant Goliath to the scheming Saul to the shifty Shimei, David never viewed his situations from his own personal perspective, but from God's. Instead of seeing Goliath as an evil enemy soldier, David saw someone who was blaspheming God and had to be stopped. When he could have viewed Saul in a similar light, David looked at the situation from God's perspective and realized that only the Lord could choose when his anointed king was meant to be dethroned, regardless of how evil he was acting at the time. When it would have been easy to take out this lone griefer who was insistent on trolling David during one of his darkest days, David saw that even this was both permitted and possibly even guided by the Lord. And most importantly, he recognized that it was the Lord that would be his defense. If he had chose to slay Saul, he would have shown himself to be no better than the man he was slaying. If he chose to silence Shimei, he would have lowered himself to the level of his insults, and ironically proven him right by those actions. In each of these circumstances, David found that it is the Lord who defends us from wrongdoers. He alone is our avenger. He alone clears our good name. And when the time is right, he and only he will resolve our conflict. Enemies and adversaries come in many forms, but through the Spirit of God, we can properly identify when we are meant to slay the giant, when we're meant to ignore and endure the threats and the insults until the fullness of time has come. So don't let the griefers distract you. They aren't worth it. They're only trying to slow you down from reaching your destination. And don't give in the temptation to fight your own battles, because the battle is always the Lord's. He will guide us when it is time to do battle on his behalf, and it will always be a battle we never intended to take on. It will be done in a way in which he and he alone will receive glory for the victory. It's easier said than done. Trust me, I know. It can be almost impossible to discern the difference between Goliath and Saul unless we bend our desires for justice and vengeance to the will of the Lord and allow him to fight for us. And in the world we live in, it's become more difficult than ever, but the message is still clear. Engage Goliath when the Lord leads us. Spare Saul, even when the Lord delivers him into our mercy. And for goodness sake, don't waste another breath on Shammai. The truest test of what is in our heart is how we treat our enemies.